Welcome to episode 28 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start, here are our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy, as the ancient Epicureans understood it, which may or may not agree with what you hear about Epicurus at other places today. Second, we aren't talking about Lucretius with the goal of promoting any modern political perspective. Epicurus must be understood on his own, and not in terms of competitive schools, which may seem similar to Epicurus, but are fundamentally different and incompatible, such as Stoicism, Humanism, Buddhism, Taoism, Atheism, or Marxism. Third, the essential base of Epicurean philosophy is a fundamental view of the nature of the universe. When you read the words of Lucretius, you will find that Epicurus did not teach the pursuit of virtue, or of luxury, or of simple living, or of science as ends in themselves, but rather the pursuit of pleasure. From this perspective, it is feeling which is the guide of life, and not supernatural gods, idealism, or virtue ethics. And as important as anything else, Epicurus taught that there is no life after death, and that any happiness we'll ever have must come in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. Now let's join the discussion with Martin reading today's text.
This being proved, I shall here join another observation which justly derives its credit from what is explained before. This is that the seeds of things that are alike and perfectly of the same figure are in number infinite. For though the variety of their figures be only finite, yet the seeds themselves that are alike in nature must indeed be infinite. Otherwise the whole of matter must be finite, which I fully proved is not. Thus having cleared the way, I shall now show in short but sweetest numbers that the seeds of matter are infinite and hold together the whole of things, by constant force of blows on every side. For though you observe some species of animals are less common, and nature seems less fruitful in their production, yet in other countries, in other places, and in lands more remote, you meet with many creatures of that kind, and more in number. For you observe the elephant, chief of beasts, wrestling his lithe proboscis like a snake. How many thousands of them in their breeds, which fortify her with a wall of ivory impenetrable, not to be forced, but we see but few at Rome. But grant, if you please, there was only one single create of a particular kind in nature, whose like was not to be found throughout the world, yet unless the seeds of which it was formed were in number infinite, it could never come into being, or, when once made, could it increase or be supported. For fancy you see the finite seeds of any body tossed about through the infinite space, whence, where, by what force, by what design, could they meet and unite in that wide ocean of matter, that strange confusion? They have no reason, I suppose, to direct them to this union. But, as in dreadful wrecks, when many ships are lost, the troubled sea scatters abroad the seats, the sterns, the sail yards, the prows, the masts, the floating oars, the flags swimming about all the shores, that they may be seen, and forewarn poor mortals to fly, and at no time to trust the treachery, the power, and the deceit of that unfaithful element, even when the perfidious flattery of a smooth face smiles upon them. So if you allow the first seeds of things to be finite, the various agitation of matter must forever toss them about, scattered as they are, so that they could never be forced to unite, or, if they could they preserve that union or admit of any increase? And yet the nature of things evidently proves that beings are produced, and, when produced, increase, and therefore the principle of things in every kind, 'tis plain, are infinite, and by them all beings are formed and supported. Nor do those motions that are fatal and destructive to beings always prevail, and cause a dissolution never to be recovered. Nor, on the contrary, do those motions by which beings are formed and increased always preserve things when they are produced. But a perpetual war has been forever carried on with equal success between the principle of things, one while the vital seeds prevail, and now again they are routed and beaten out of the field. The cries of infant beings, which they send out as soon as they see the light, are mingled with the funeral of others that are departed. nor is there a night that follows the day, nor a morning which succeeds the night, that does not hear the groans, the attendants of death, and sad obsequies, mingled with the tender laments of newborn babes rising into being.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And to sort of summarize what this section talks about on the Epicurean Friends webpage, we have the Monroe summary. And Monroe says that this discussion is about, quote, the number of shapes being finite, the number of atoms of each shape is infinite, since it was proved in the first book that the sum of matter was infinite. If you say that some animals are more scarce than would be the case if the atoms of which they were made were infinite, I answer, these animals may be very numerous in remote regions, but even if one thing of its kind existed in the whole world, this would imply an infinite sum of atoms. Else, how could these have met and united in the boundless ocean of matter? The first beginnings, therefore, of every shape and kind are infinite in number. And then the last paragraph, he says that means that thus production and destruction alternately prevail, their elements ever waging equal war. No day passes without some dying and some being born. So as we get started today, let's try to stay with the high-level conclusions and see if anybody has any issues with these high-level conclusions. And then for the rest of our time today, let's try to go back and discuss some of the more basic issues that are involved in Lucretius's analysis. But actually, I want to comment on the second one first, because it has always stayed in my mind how DeWitt made the observation that the forces of creation or maintenance in the universe as a whole actually, in the end, prevail over the forces of destruction, because even though any individual body within the universe ultimately will be destroyed, everything that comes together eventually goes apart. The universe as a whole never goes away. So the forces of continuance in the end are things that stay there, if you want to call it a force. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'd like to hear what Martin says about that before I comment, because I think that's only right in the near term, in the temporarily. But let's say, Martin, what would you say?
Give us your astronomical physics analysis, Martin. Is the universe eventually going to go away for good?
Yeah, that is the question. I mean, it will not disappear into nothing, but it will somehow change in a way that life forms can no more be supported.
Right. So if the expanding observations are right and it continues, then there will be this heat death. So the particles won't be coming together anymore to form new things. So this is not exactly true, right? Am I saying that right, Martin?
Yes, but we also need to see that from a practical perspective. It doesn't matter because
it doesn't matter right now.
Yeah,
so it's
billions of years away, and us on Earth will our offspring will no more exist. Eventually, all offspring from Earth will have died out before that.
So the logic here is incorrect, but the processes that make it incorrect are happening so slowly that it doesn't have any practical significance for us. But it is, unfortunately, another example where using reason does not lead to the same quality of conclusions as using direct observation.
I forget which episode we talked about this, but this exact point was made almost word for word, actually.
Yeah. Well,
it's on the same subject.
Yeah.
That from our perspective of time and how much will progress in our lifetimes in comparison to the heat death of the universe, it may as well be infinite.
Yeah. I think it's still important to take this opportunity to remind people of the unreliability of logic when it comes to deciding on fact, because there will be plenty of times when you'll hear people ask you to make political decisions, life decisions. How am I going to, live based on logic? And you always want to go back to evidence. So it didn't turn out to matter to us that this logical conclusion is inaccurate, but it could have. So be a show me person. Stick with the evidence.
Okay, well, maybe that is a good introduction into just the fact that we've got a lot of sections coming up in the remainder of book 2 and 3 and the remainder of the whole poem, where we're going to basically get into a routine where we see him say something, think that modern theories do not bear it out, And if we just simply say modern theories don't bear it out every day, it's going to get awfully monotonous in our review of the poem. So I think the best way to try to address that is to make sure we tie the direction he's going into sort of some high-level conclusions that are practical to us, because whether the heat death of the universe theory is correct or not, and I certainly personally have no ability to say it's incorrect or correct or whatever, it is something that conflicts with the conclusion that Lucretius was drawing here, at least in some respects. I remember Martin earlier on saying something about the universe collapsing so that life would be impossible. I'm not really sure that Lucretius is saying that life is what he's talking about. It could be that he's just simply saying that the universe exists in some form throughout time. But I think he's basically wanting to defend a general conception of the universe as being formed out of atoms, and he's trying to extrapolate his theory out as far as he can, and possibly further than he should have, and unless they felt to the extent maybe he felt the idea that it was needed to address some certain religious arguments or something about God being eternal but the universe is not, or whatever, that possibly could be going on. But there's just a lot of things being discussed here that go back into issues of basically epistemology and knowledge and what it means to hold something to be true and whether we should be confident in something or not, and how that applies to ethics, how it applies to physics. And if we stay at the very detailed level, I think we're going to miss the implications of probably, again, the big picture, because even though Elaine is making very clear statements about disagreeing with Lucretius's detailed analysis, at least as I listen to Elaine's perspective, I don't hear it differing tremendously from what I read Epicurus to have said. And that's another point I wanted to bring out today, is that as we go through the poem, each of the major points are generally reflected at a very higher level in the letter to Herodotus. For example, today, the issue of numbers of sizes of the atoms. Somebody who's reading along in the poem can also find the parallel section in the letter to Herodotus. I'm referring, one of the easier places to find it on the internet is going to be in Bailey's Extant Remains, which is available pretty much at different places like archive.org. And on page 23 of the Extant Remains, the letter to Herodotus, there's a paragraph from Bailey where Epicurus says this. He says, "Moreover, the universe is boundless. For that which is bounded has an extreme point, and the extreme point is seen against something else, so that as it has no extreme point, it has no limit. And as it has no limit, it must be boundless and not bounded. Furthermore, the infinite is boundless both in the number of the bodies and in the extent of the void. For if on the one hand the void were boundless and the bodies were limited in number, the bodies would not stay anywhere, but would be carried about and scattered through the infinite void, not having other bodies to support them and keep them in place by means of collisions. But if, on the other hand, the void were limited, the infinite bodies would not have room wherein to take their place. Besides this, the indivisible and solid bodies, out of which too the compounds are created and into which they are dissolved, have an incomprehensible number of varieties in shape. For it is not possible that such great varieties of things should arise from the same atomic shapes if they are limited in number. And so in each shape, the atoms are quite infinite in number, but their differences in shape are not quite infinite, but only incomprehensible in number." Okay, so there's another distinction that we haven't talked about anywhere. What's the difference between infinite and incomprehensible in number, or innumerable? I think Epicurus is probably making distinctions like that are not familiar to us to think about. And so those are higher level issues that we probably ought to be talking about as we go through some of the details.
Yeah, regarding not infinite, but innumerable. So this is a thing we just don't know what that number is. So it can be any number. There is no principal limit on it. No? So it can be finite. It might not be finite, but we just have no way to know this, at least with the physics of 2,500 years ago.
I don't want to go too far into this maybe, but what does infinite mean?
So I think you have to be careful. If you use modern definitions, they're really not that different. So I hope it's more like what Martin was saying. So innumerable means not capable of being counted, enumerated, or numbered, hence indefinitely numerous. Okay. of a great number, while infinite is indefinitely large, countlessly great, or immense. So there's really this indefinite is the key. We don't know. It might be infinite.
This is where I think I'm sensing an issue. Is there a difference between saying we don't know, but it's clearly a real number? Yes, but it's clearly a lot, versus infinity being some kind of a pseudo mystical concept that it's like God. Nobody knows really what God is when they talk about a God, but infinity kind of has that same quality, I think, at least in common discussion. It's almost a mystical concept that says that no matter how far out you go, new things are going to appear as if from nothing. But innumerable to me means definitely there's only a certain number of things. It's just that as a human, we can't count it. How much of what we're talking about with infinity boils down to, as a human, we don't have the ability to count it?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Although if you can't count it for sure, you can't rule out that it's infinite, right, Martin?
Yes, and there's another complication here. Unfortunately, mathematics has used a definition of innumerable, which is one subset of infinite. And then they have, I don't know the right English word for this one. So and then there's even a level of hyper innumerable of infinity. So there are two different measures in infinity for infinity in mathematics. So one is that it's innumerable, but you can make a bijection between the natural numbers and what you're looking at. It's still infinite, but in some way you can count it, but you don't reach a limit. It's limitless. And then there are, like real numbers, there are more than that.
Meaning that if you could live long enough, you could eventually count these things.
No, not in mathematics. Because
well, that's okay,
that's
and that's
still
okay,
infinite.
Okay, and that's my concern, is that and there's some kind of a mathematical definition of infinite, which essentially takes it out of the realm of reality.
No, because Epicurus talks about the universe being infinite, and that's not out of reality. It's just.
How does and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, Elaine. How does somebody who's not a professional philosopher get their mind around the issue of, is there a difference between, I think that's what he's saying, at least in this part of the letter to Herodotus. He's saying that the number of shapes of atoms is not infinite, but it is innumerable.
So that's why I was saying I don't think I would use modern translations of innumerable, because it's like what Martin says.
So what is Epicurus saying? What point is he trying to make?
I think he's just saying we don't know how many there are. There's a lot.
Well, the Bailey translates it as incomprehensible.
Yeah,
incomprehensible.
To me, it means there's just a whole lot. We don't know how many, but it's not endless. Mm-hmm. We just don't know where it stops, but it's not infinite. But he definitely talks about infinity, so we can't say.
Right. He definitely has finite versus infinite.
Yeah.
But then he's also got this category here of incomprehensibility as opposed to infinite. And every time he praises something, I implicitly want to ask this question. Well, he must have thought this was an important point, or he would not have included it in his letter to Herodotus. What is the distinction that he's trying to make here? And I think it has a lot to do with limits. So go ahead.
And again, I wouldn't. Our modern feeling about incomprehensible has that. I can't get my mind around it. I doubt if that's what he means. He just means it's so big we can't count it. We don't know what it is. Maybe it's not possible to count them, but that it's not like, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine it kind of feeling. It's just that there's a lot.
That's
we don't know.
Maybe Don or Ellie could help in that regard.
Right.
The Greek.
But again, what do you guys think Epicurus wanted you to draw from this distinction? He wouldn't have said it if he didn't think it was a significant distinction, I don't think. So what's the significance of the distinction?
Possibly it's just that he wants to make his theory or his hypothesis on the atoms complete, so that there is not an open issue which people might attack.
So, no, I think it's that getting back to what we talked about in earlier sections is that if you had infinite numbers of elementary particles, we actually we don't think we have innumerable numbers of types of elementary particles, right? That turned out to be totally not right. But if you had infinite types of elementary particles, there would be no real predictability to what was going to pop into existence. I mean, it would throw the whole sort of regularity of observations into confusion.
I think that's the direction, Elaine, is that Epicurus is constantly keeping a really big picture in mind, that in order to live happily, live successfully, you've got to be able to grasp the limits of things and grasp the difference between reality and unreality. That this whole idea of God and the supernatural realm and life after death and so forth, these are things that have no evidence to support them. And they become, I think, in a lot of people's minds, something that's fantasy. The word fantasy and unreal and hypothetical, those words kind of blend together at some point for, I think, a lot of people. And I'm thinking that Epicurus is wanting to emphasize that it's essential in life to be able to draw a line and say, I'm going to go this far and no further in terms of possibilities or hypotheticals or speculation.
So I think all he needed to support that conclusion would be to say we can observe the things that would happen if there were infinite elementary particles are not happening. So we know that he screwed up when he said that means they're innumerable. No. So then that's not right. But he got part of it really well.
I'd have to reread one of the dialogues in Plato's Timaeus, the one where he talks about the 5 shapes. I'm thinking, just quickly rereading the letter to Herodotus, this may have been more of a anti-Platonic sentiment instead. The second sentence about the shapes being incomprehensible is Bailey translation. And so in each shape, the atoms are quite infinite in number, but their differences of shape are not quite infinite, but only incomprehensible in number.
Yeah, so that second phrase was the wrong one, and it was because reason was used beyond what it could support in evidence. But the first part, I think there's sufficient observation evidence to base that on. So that worked.
While you're thinking, Charles, I don't want today's show to go by without mentioning the word isonomia. I gather for somebody who's reading into some of the other deeper aspects of some of the theories, I think commentators use this section as an example of the word isonomia when he's talking about animals being less common in one area but more common in another area. And that's also something that's referenced in the Velleius section of Cicero's on the nature of the gods. But I don't know that it has any major implication for us today to continue on to that. But I didn't want to not mention that today. But maybe this is the point to get really general again and go back into the issue of the Epicurean theory of knowledge and logic and how that applies here. This discussion today gets us back into the general issues that some people have about the role of science and the role of inquiry and the limits of how far we need to go in studying science in order to live a happy life. There are some people who think that Epicurus or Lucretius, if you follow that train of thought, that they would lead us into accepting answers for things that are incomplete and just not pursuing science like some of us would think it would need to be pursued. And so there's a general question out there that a lot of people debate about really what Epicurus and Lucretius's attitude towards science really is. Is it simply of interest to us just because we want to not worry about life after death and supernatural control and fate and things like that? Because if so, why do we need to even worry about science after what was developed in this poem? We could just read the poem and never worry about science again, have our fears about gods and death be put to rest, and then just go on in life without ever pursuing any more scientific inquiry at all. Do we think that that is what Epicurus and Lucretius were suggesting?
No, I don't think that's what they were suggesting. So you need to make enough observations to be sure that you haven't seen anything supernatural, is how I would put it.
Well, Elaine, your goal would not be, wouldn't it be fair to say, though, that your goal is not necessarily to validate your conclusion that there's nothing supernatural? Your goal would be, you want to know what reality is first, right?
Yeah,
let me say
that. Yeah. So, yes, you want to know what you're basing your decisions about pleasure and pain on. So the the canon always comes first. So that's where physics comes from conclusions based on the canon.
Why does the canon come first?
Because that is the entire bedrock of the philosophy, that you have made a commitment to saying that there is a reality, that we observe it, through our senses, that we have feelings in response to reality, and that we have these prolepses, which we'll get to, I guess, what I think of as pattern recognitions that are innate to our species. But the observations and feelings, I don't think anybody can be confused about, which you have to make a decision. If you're going to have a philosophy, how you're going to make your decisions about what's true. Are you going to say that we can't ever know anything about reality and be a skeptic? Are you going to say that you know reality by thinking about it and by logic and abstract reasoning, and that's how you figure out what's real? Or are you going to say there's no such thing? There's all these positions that you can have, and that is the Epicurean position. And if you don't start from there, you can't be an Epicurean.
What is the Epicurean position?
What I just said, that we know about what's true, what's real, through our senses, through feelings, and through the prolepses. And that, we don't have these other positions, obviously, which are incompatible with that.
Yeah.
Charles wants to say something.
Yeah,
what do you want to do?
Two things. I guess to finish my earlier thought about the shapes, I'm not going to reread sections of Plato in the middle of this, but it seems that it's more about the elementary particles having a not infinite, but I guess we're going to fall into the same trap of incomprehensible or innumerable numbers of combinations to produce different things. It's just that I was a bit hung up on the word shapes, because it seemed like there was some more contemporary to Epicurus issues regarding shapes, specifically the five Platonic solids in Plato's Timaeus, where he argues about the four classical elements corresponding to different shapes, and then the dodecahedron getting tied into theology and creation. For my second thought, it's something I wanted to bring up earlier when we were talking about how the universe may as well be infinite according to our perception of time, with what Elaine just said and Cassius about epistemology. And it's something that we all agree with, that the Epicurean canon or epistemology is the foundation, and the ethics of pleasure and pain depend on those. Because you can't have a solid conclusion that justifies why you believe pleasure is good and pain is bad. And without that foundation, you open up pain and pleasure to a lot of subjective or varying explanations or apologetics.
Okay. Well, let's stay with what Elaine was saying a minute ago, that we have the Epicurean canon that Epicurus has asserted as the way we should think based on the senses, the feelings, and the anticipations. But where Elaine, I think, was going to go next is, even if you accept that and just say, okay, I'm going to follow you guys for right now and I'll accept your premise, where does that premise about the way to think and the standard of truth, where does that lead you in terms of science and your attitude towards science?
I think it makes you commit to being sure that your conclusions are evidentiary and understanding the difference between a theory and a hypothesis.
Let me go back in a different direction, maybe even more basically. The canon that we discussed through Epicurus, I think it's more generally known as the canon of truth.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and wrestle with the basic issue. What is truth? Pontius Pilate, what is truth?
Truth is what we accept as real. So, I think this gets to, I'm going to go Epicurus on you. It's like, if you don't know what I'm saying when I say sugar is sweet, we can't talk.
Well, are you saying that about truth?
Yes. Everybody knows. I almost used a cuss word. What we mean when we say that word. It's not confusing.
Well, I'm not sure I really agree with that.
Well, their conclusions about what might be true can differ, but they can hold an idea of what truth is or how something lines up with conviction to being a part of reality.
You can make it, Cassius, into an abstract concept if you try hard enough. But when people talk about it, what reality, what truth is, everybody really knows what they mean. And I think Epicurus would argue strenuously against trying to make this a definition more than I would even go so far as to say what almost everybody, except perhaps professional philosophers, mean when they say reality could be thought of as a prolepsis. You're using a word to know, like, yes, this is real, and it's not a confusing thing.
But isn't in common discussion, at least, there are a lot of debate about your truth versus my truth versus whether there's absolute truth, whether there's contextual truth? Aren't there a lot of questions there that have to be sort of
and
set
that's
the table
how
for?
you make things confusing if you're a professional philosopher.
Right. Is any part of that legitimate, though, to a normal person? Or are you saying that all of that discussion is not even really legitimate?
Wouldn't all of those truths in every single one of those categories hold a sort of common ground with each other? One that everybody could instantly recognize as,
People
true.
are saying this is real. This happened. This is the situation.
Or if it's within this context, like you said, contextual truth, then under these circumstances, this pattern will repeat itself and make it's known, it's real. We can verify it.
Yeah, when we're saying context, the truth for that person means it is including their feelings, which are part of the canon of truth. Their feelings are real phenomena, that they're part of reality. So I don't see any conflict there at all between what ordinary people mean.
Okay, I want to ask Martin to weigh in on this, but maybe the question then simply is, as an Epicurean, or if Epicurus were here to talk to us, what would he tell us the word truth means? Martin, do you want to weigh in at this point? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, not really. I basically agree with Elaine that this is a prolepsis. I mean, we can talk a bit around it to somehow make it clear, but it's just basically tickling our association on this one.
It's basically doing what on your association? Tickling your association?
Yeah, I mean, to examine that thought pattern we have when we think about truth.
Okay, so Elaine, to summarize, if Epicurus were here, and he were listening to us or anybody out in the world discuss the meaning of truth, if he were to have somebody walk up to him, and I can't cite the Bible verse, but somebody quotes Jesus saying to Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilate said that to Jesus, didn't he? Pontius Pilate's question to Jesus, what is truth? What would Epicurus say if Pontius Pilate asked Epicurus, what is truth?
I think he would do one of those pithy things like kick a rock or something. I mean, he'd be like, what's the quote? People who can go around blathering all day about this and that, or just get real. I mean, I just think he would roll his eyes. I think that's a ridiculous question.
All right, now let's separate out. You're saying that's what Epicurus would say.
Yes,
what would Elaine say?
Same. It's
Okay.
like everybody knows, unless they're trying to be abstractionist, if somebody comes up to you and says, this is what I believe about reality, or this is how I experience reality, or this is true, people know what each other mean with that word. It's not confusing.
Charles, same two questions. If Pontius Pilate goes to Epicurus and asks, what is truth? What would Epicurus say? Or if you prefer, first, what would Charles say?
I think in my little spiel earlier about consistent behavior making itself known and what is observable.
That's Epicurus, or that's Charles?
That's probably Charles.
All right, well, just trying to channel what we've read through your reading in Epicurus. Do you remember anything specific that would lead you to think about what Epicurus would say in response to the question, what is truth? There's actually a section in, if I remember correctly, it's the letter to Herodotus about true versus real at some point. Probably can't find it today, but try to put it in the show notes later on. And maybe it's related to the discussion of what opinion means.
I mean, if we want to go along that route, we could say that Epicurus would say that truth is the end goal of the canon, or the purpose of the canon, how you arrive there. But that seems like a ton of speculation and assumptions about some extant writings we don't have.
Well, let me come back to you in a second. Martin, what do you think Epicurus would say if Pontius Pilate asked him what is truth?
I mean, he would refer to this, that when we hear a word like this, we just know it, and it would be potentially misleading to try to nail it down, because we possibly won't agree on that.
So therefore you're saying that truth is something that needs to be agreed on.
I mean, we just know it. It's this type of prolepsis, no? So it's one of these words where we recognize what it is without that we need a definition.
Right. You can turn it into something that you don't know if you quibble about it, but it's just like you taste sugar, you know that everybody uses the word sweet for that, you know what you're experiencing. People have agreed to use the word truth for this prolepsis, this recognition of it's kind of like a sensation almost of truth, and that's it. That's what they mean.
Okay. I think we got on this direction because we were talking about the role of science and the role of speculation about theories of atoms and so forth. And so how do we relate our viewpoint of truth to our attitude towards science? Is science judged by whether it is true or not? And how do we take our definition that we've just been talking about what true means and say that this is what applies to science? And again, I'm not trying to be too divorced from reality here. I'm trying to say, what would you tell a child, maybe even a high school student if you want to go that high, but what would you tell a child who's asking you about these questions in a sincere way? I think that you can sincerely be confused about questions like this, especially if you come from a religious background or just not a very scientifically trained background. You're not used to dealing with issues like this. And so you could have a child come to you and say, I read my Bible today and Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? And Jesus didn't give him an answer.
Okay, so here I think you have, and also I just want to get back to say to your Pontius Pilate example, we also want to take into account that Epicurus would have, or Jesus, if that actually happened, knew the intentions of Pontius Pilate, that he wasn't a benign questioner, right? He wasn't sincere. So that messes with that a little bit. But all right, so I think the important thing to explain to the child is that science is not the conclusions. Right? Science is a process. Science is an approach, and it's consistent with the canon of truth. So it's not even the data, and it's not the conclusions you draw from the data. It is an agreement about how to examine reality, how to describe it to each other. There's some common language in that scientists use to talk to each other, but it is not the information itself is not science. And that is poorly taught or not taught to students today.
Elaine, let's go back for a second. Let me double down on the question, and let's talk about what is taught, what has been taught for 2,000 years to the West. The New International Version, John 18:37. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And then Pilate says, what is truth? Retorted Pilate. So everybody, at least until recent years in Western civilization, has been taught that Jesus testified that he came into the world to testify to the truth. Mm-hmm. And that all who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. Mm-hmm. So truth comes from God. Truth has to be passed on by some supernatural being, or is there a truth that isn't supernatural? And if we have a truth to ourselves, if there is a human truth, what is the basis of human truth? And I understand that we've previously been saying in this episode that it's a prolepsis. It's something that, like sugar is sweet, you recognize it whether that's true or not. And I'm not necessarily saying I agree with that. I don't necessarily think that's probably a complete enough explanation. But whatever the explanation is, which we're not going to get to the bottom to today, what is truth to an Epicurean?
I don't have anything to add that I haven't said. I think it's one of those things that I'm hoping Ellie would say, it's the obvious.
But is it fair to say, Elaine, that what you've been saying is that truth is what we understand through the senses, the anticipations, and the feelings?
Yes, yeah, but it's also itself the feeling of truth. If there's a feeling of truth, it's like, you know what I'm talking about. If you make a statement, I know this is true, there's a sensation, there's an internal sensation you get along with that. And we use the word truth to just, communicate that to each other.
Okay, we're probably going to be out of time for me to pursue that any further, which is probably a good thing. But before we close today, I definitely want to go back again to a discussion that we're having in a related thread on Epicurean Friends Forum about the role of science in our perspective. Maybe it's not our perspective on truth or not, but what is our attitude towards science? Are Epicurus and Lucretius teaching us to look for a plausible explanation, find any plausible explanation that seems to make sense to us, and then forget science and put science on the side? And I think Elaine's already said the answer to that is no. Maybe we should
because using our senses is part of science. Making observations, that is part of the process of science. So you would never stop observing what's happening.
How much time do you need to devote to studying atoms, Elaine? How much time does the normal person need to think about atoms?
I think probably not very much, but you always constantly need to be observing what's going on around you in the world in order to be able to make decisions about what to do. And science has developed particular methods of helping you test your observations, still using, senses, extensions of your senses, but to keep you from getting accidentally caught up in a fallacious heuristics, to help you really stick to your observations to make your conclusions. So we're using science all the time if we're making wise decisions, because we're making observations about reality, about what we observe, and then we're deciding what to do to get pleasure.
Charles, what has reading Epicurus and Lucretius done for your general attitude and the way you employ science in your life?
Well, my best class in high school regarding science was chemistry, not physics. But for science, I've been a lot more in tune with my senses and just generally more trusting of them. But I'd have to agree with Elaine here that informally we are always sort of within that mindset of using it.
You're within the mindset of you acknowledge and you hold science and scientists in high regard as something that ultimately improves your life, improves your pleasure, and is something that is consistent with someone who is pursuing pleasure in life is going to be friendly to science and employ science in making his life more pleasurable and less painful. Is that fair to say?
Generally speaking, yeah. I could probably see some examples, but they would be kind of ham-fisted or contrived. But that would be about different definitions of what constitutes as pleasure. But I would say, generally speaking, having met other hedonists who are not Epicurean, even they acknowledge the role of science, even if it was just for the purpose of defeating theology.
Okay. And Martin, Elaine, of course, is a physician. You are an engineer of a type. What does your Epicurean reading do for your attitude towards scientific inquiry? Does it promote it? Does it suppress it? Is it irrelevant to it?
Our science, the way we do science, is compatible with Epicurean philosophy. And so it's, how to say this, it mutually supports itself. I mean, we can do science without being Epicureans. And as an Epicurean, we do not have to bother that much about pursuing science by ourselves, but both are fully compatible.
So, Martin, let me ask if you would agree with this. I think there's a risk in using too narrow a definition of science. The science is really, to me, the process of using the canon. So we do it if we're going to live wisely and make good choices for pleasure. We're doing it all the time because we're relying on our observations about reality to predict what will happen if we make different decisions, and doing that accurately, that's not separable from science. So you don't have to be a physicist to approach life with that kind of evidentiary view. So I think the Epicurean philosophy says use science to make your observations, not mythology.
Yeah, Martin, you used the word compatible, but I would have expected you to use a stronger word than that. That they like you said, they reinforce each other. They're almost identical in many ways.
Integral.
Integral.
It is. I mean, that's necessary to the canon. You can't understand any of the rest of the philosophy unless you're going to have a scientific attitude about it.
Yes, it encourages science. And what Elaine just said, in order to use the canon, you have to understand how it operates, the senses. You have to understand how the senses operate and when they're going to be clear and when they're distorted and
so
no,
that's
things.
Evidence. That's data. So let me I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just
Sure.
that's not the process of science. That is data and conclusions, and those are fine. But science is actually, the way, how you're going to go about it. And that's what our philosophy says, is go about this by making observations. Notice your feelings, which are, your experiences that you're having, and be aware of your prolepses. If you don't do that, you're not an Epicurean. So it's fundamental. That's science. Science is not the information that you obtain through the process of science.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Science is not the information that you obtain, but it's the process. I would have probably thought it was both.
No, I mean, not really. And that's what I feel is one of the fundamental failures of our education system, in making people think that the science is the information in the textbook. It's not. It's how you got that information and how you're going to get more.
Okay. In the interest of time, I want to ask for closing comments. But before I do that, that reminds me, I was already going to refer back to what Francis Wright says in a couple of places in A Few Days in Athens. But the classic example that some people who object to the Epicurean view of science are going to use is that there's the example, and I'm going to butcher his name, but Polyaenus, who was apparently a geometrician who was well known for his abilities in geometry, but he became an Epicurean. And on page 108 of A Few Days in Athens, there's a discussion from Francis Wright defending that episode in Epicurean history, that what Epicurus' advice to Polyaenus, who was a geometrician, was not to give up geometry, not to throw it away, but to realize that there are other things in life besides geometry, and to realize that geometry and everything you do in life should be organized within sort of your overall framework towards life, which when you get to the bottom line, again, it's a matter of pleasure and pain. So that geometry is not a goal in itself, an end in itself, any more than any other virtue or any other procedure would be. And that would be where we are today, right, Elaine? Science is not an end in itself. Would you agree with that as an Epicurean reader?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And of course, you say, yes, sure, but that's something that some people are going to really get their backs up about. Anybody who's not really into the Epicurean theory is going to have some particular virtue or some particular thing in life they like, and they're going to see it as an end in themselves. And all Epicurus is doing. But
we'll tell them that they're just enjoying it, and that's fine.
Right. So, yes, I don't have a page number reference. I have page 108 of A Few Days in Athens for the Polyaenus discussion. But there's also a discussion that backs up what Elaine said just a moment ago about science being observation versus conclusions versus theories, that science is a procedure versus, I think what that was your point, Elaine, is that science is more a procedure rather than a particular conclusion. And there's a section where Francis Wright elaborates on that point as well. Okay, closing comments for today's episode 28. Who wants to go first? And
we know the episode.
Martin's always first.
Wait, exactly right. There's no question who goes first. The first closing comment comes from Martin in Cologne.
Yeah, I have no closing comments for today.
Aww.
Well, I have a feeling we'll be revisiting some of these issues in future episodes, and so we can let Martin elaborate in the future. Charles, what about your closing thoughts for today?
I would have to say that if you're going to value pleasure, you have to understand, or at least come up with a comprehensive view of nature and the universe, specifically within the context if you want to be Epicurean.
And that's what we're doing by reading Lucretius, and what Lucretius was doing by studying the nature of the universe. Mm-hmm. And advising people that in order to avoid being like children who are afraid of things in the dark that are absolutely not going to harm them, the way to avoid floundering around in the dark is to have a systematic study of nature.
And that's why these first two books of Lucretius are so heavily focused on the physics compared to sections of 3 and then book 4 and then parts of 5.
Yes, right. It's interesting to me how Lucretius does not go in the same order that Epicurus does in the letter to Herodotus. And Lucretius also scatters his discussions of epistemology, the issues that would be related to the canon of truth. He kind of mentions them here and there, but he does not systematically present them at the beginning of the book, for example. So
neither does Diogenes Laertius. He starts off with a letter to Herodotus, saving the letter on ethics, the letter to Minucius, for last.
Yes. Now, I wouldn't hold Diogenes Laertius as an example of somebody who's definitely an Epicurean, definitely presenting it in the way Epicurus would, but Lucretius pretty much is. And it's interesting that Lucretius is not gone by the same order as the letter to Herodotus. Of course, we don't know whether that tells us what the order of Epicurus's own nature was. Maybe the own nature extended volume is the same order that Lucretius had. But whatever it is, there was apparently a separate scroll titled The Canon of Truth. And so they didn't just put a section at the beginning of the physics that would have explained some of these epistemological issues.
Yeah.
Okay, Elaine, your closing thoughts for today.
I don't have too much to say about the section that we read today, but I guess my summary for our other conversation, actually, I'll just say to the listeners, it might be interesting if you've never done this before to once a day think about some of the decisions that you've made. And, for your life, just small ones like how you're going to spend your day, or larger ones, and think about the process that you used to decide that and how you knew what was true and what wasn't.
I think it's very good advice. Very good advice. And we will elaborate on that as many times as we can in coming episodes. Okay, so with that, I think we're ready to say goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
All right, y'all have a good week.
And we'll do it again soon.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.